Welcome to Night Whisper. Night Whisper brings you the darkest tales from the shadows. Join our community. Subscribe, leave a like, and prepare yourself for stories that will haunt your dreams. The store that feeds on the living. I've been trying to get it down on paper for almost 2 years now. Whenever I took my seat at my desk and opened a fresh document, my hands were shaking something awful, and I had to get up and walk away. But I vowed that if I ever worked up the nerve, I would let the world know what actually went down in Hollow Ridge. Not the official story that got printed in the local press, not the gas leak explanation that the county sheriff's office doled out to anyone who asked. The truth that took 3 lives and left me never setting foot in the Appalachians again. My name is Caleb Porter, and I worked at Hale's General Store for 3 years in a town called Hollow Ridge. You haven't heard of it either? Don't worry about it. It doesn't appear on any maps either. It's situated deep in a valley where 3 ranges of mountains meet, completely out of range of any highway and worlds away from the likes of civilization. A place where cell phone reception comes to die, where strangers are viewed with the same suspicion as a rattlesnake on your porch. I got there the same way that most folks get places like Hollow Ridge. I was running from something. In my case, it was a broken engagement, credit card debt, and a drinking problem that had gotten me fired from my warehouse job in Knoxville. My cousin had a guy who had a guy, and before I knew it, I was loading up my truck with what little I had left, including my loyal but inconspicuous pickup, and pointing it into the misty mountains with no clear end game other than to get as far away as possible for a little while. When I first spotted the Hale's General Store building, it reminded me of something taken from a photo taken in the 1950s. This is because it basically had remained that way since Vernon Hale's father constructed it back in 1952, right down to the hand-painted sign that hung over the front door and the creaky wooden porch where the old-timers hung out talking about the good old days and complaining about the weather. It was the type of establishment that sold you everything from canned vegetables to hunting rifles, where you could purchase a fishing license and a pound of butter in one fell swoop, and where everyone, including their relatives, was known by name to Vernon Hale. Vernon hired me in the 5 minutes it took me to meet with him. I was actually looking for directions to a motel, but he took one look at me and determined that I was more in need of an honest day's work than a soft bed. He was right. Within the end of that one initial meeting, I was employed stocking shelves and renting a room above the store for what little it cost to live there. It was a lifeline, and for the first year or so, it was precisely that. But I should have paid more attention to the warnings, not the obvious ones. Vernon never sat me down and told me the store was cursed or that people had died there under mysterious circumstances. The warnings were subtler than that. They were in the way the locals avoided lingering after dark, always finishing their shopping well before sunset and hurrying out to their trucks with barely a goodbye. They were in the way Owen Rusk, our stockroom manager, would sometimes freeze in the middle of a task and stare at the walls like he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. They were in the prayers that Vernon muttered under his breath every morning before unlocking the front door, words I could never quite make out, but which always left him looking pale and exhausted. I should have asked questions. I should have demanded answers. But the truth is, I didn't want to know. I was finally getting my life back on track. I'd been sober for 8 months. I was saving money, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had a future worth looking forward to. The last thing I wanted was to dig up something that might shatter that fragile peace. So when the accidents started happening, I told myself they were just that. Accidents. Tragic, yes. Unexplainable, perhaps. But nothing more than the kind of bad luck that can strike anywhere, anytime, to anyone. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things. The first death happened on a Thursday in late October, right around the time when the mountains start putting on their autumn colors and the air gets that crisp bite that tells you winter isn't far behind. Owen Rusk had been working at the store longer than anyone except Vernon himself. He was a quiet man in his mid-40s, with hands like leather gloves and a face that had been weathered by decades of hard living. Before coming to work for Vernon, he'd spent 20 years in the coal mines that used to dot these mountains like open wounds. The Blackwood mine had been the last one to close, and Owen had been there on the day they sealed it up for good. He never talked about his mining days, at least not to me. But sometimes, when the store was quiet and the afternoon shadow started creeping across the floor, I'd catch him staring off into the distance with an expression that made my chest tight. It was the look of a man carrying a weight that no one else could see, and I recognized it because I'd worn that same expression myself during my darkest drinking days. Owen was in the stockroom that Thursday afternoon, moving boxes of canned goods from the delivery pallets to the storage shelves. It was routine work, the kind of thing he'd done 1,000 times before. I was up front helping Marcy Dillard with a rush of customers. There was a church potluck that weekend, and half the town seemed to be stocking up on ingredients for casseroles and desserts. The scream came at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon. I know because I happened to glance at the clock above the register right before I heard it. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies, loud and dramatic and sustained. It was short and sharp, more like a bark of surprise than an expression of pain. But there was something in the quality of that sound, something raw and primal, that made every hair on my body stand at attention. I was through the stockroom door before I even consciously decided to move. What I found on the other side has never left me. It visits me in dreams, in quiet moments when my guard is down, in the split second before sleep when the mind is most vulnerable to unwanted memories. Owen was on the floor, pinned beneath a collapsed shelf unit that must have weighed close to 1,000 pounds when fully loaded. The unit was one of the old industrial ones, bolted to the wall with steel brackets that Vernon's father had installed decades ago. Those brackets had never failed before. They weren't supposed to fail. They were designed to hold 10 times the weight that Owen typically stored on them, but they had failed. All 6 of them, simultaneously. I rushed to Owen's side and tried to lift the shelf off him, but it was impossibly heavy and the angle was all wrong. His eyes found mine, and what I saw in them wasn't pain or fear, it was recognition. Like he'd been expecting this moment for a long time and was almost relieved that it had finally arrived. He tried to say something. His lips moved, forming words that I couldn't hear over the pounding of my own heart. I leaned closer, pressing my ear almost to his mouth, and what I heard made my blood turn to ice water. "It's awake," he whispered. "The old hungry thing. It's finally awake." Then his eyes went glassy, and he was gone. The official cause of death was listed as accidental crushing. The county inspector who examined the scene concluded that the shelf brackets had simply given way due to metal fatigue and age. It was a tragic accident, nothing more. "These things happen," he said. "Old buildings, old equipment, old infrastructure. Sooner or later, something's bound to fail." But I knew better. I'd helped Owen inspect those brackets just 2 weeks earlier, part of a routine maintenance check that Vernon insisted on every month. They'd been solid as the day they were installed, not a single sign of stress or weakness. And even if they had been failing, what were the odds of all 6 giving way at the exact same moment? I tried to talk to Vernon about it, but he just shook his head and told me that some questions were better left unasked. When I pressed him, really pressed him, he got this look on his face that I'd never seen before. It was the look of a man who was terrified, not of something that might happen, but of something that was already happening, something he was powerless to stop. "Owen knew the risks when he took this job," Vernon said, and that was all he would say on the matter. We buried Owen in the little cemetery behind the Baptist church on the hill, the same church where his parents and grandparents were buried, going back 5 generations. The preacher talked about Owen's service to the community, his years in the mines, his quiet faith. He talked about the mystery of God's plan and the promise of eternal life. He didn't talk about the look of recognition in Owen's eyes as he lay dying, or the words he'd whispered with his last breath. The whole town turned out for the funeral. Nearly 200 people crowded into a building designed to hold maybe half that many. I watched them file in, these faces I'd come to know over my time in Hollow Ridge. The Brennan family from the farm up the road. Old Mrs. Coyle, who bought the same groceries every Tuesday like clockwork. The Parker twins, who ran the auto shop and always came in smelling like engine oil and cigarette smoke. They all looked somber, respectful, exactly how you'd expect people to look at a funeral. But there was something else in their expressions too. Something I couldn't quite identify at the time, but would come to recognize later. It was resignation. The look of people who had seen this before and expected to see it again. Afterward, there was a reception at the VFW hall, and I remember standing in the corner with a glass of sweet tea, watching all these people who had known Owen their whole lives share stories and memories about him. That's when I noticed something strange. Nobody was talking about how he died. They talked about his childhood, his mining days, his volunteer work with the fire department. They talked about the way he could make anyone laugh with his dry sense of humor and the way he'd give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. But not a single person mentioned the accident at the store. Not a single person asked how it happened or why. It was like they already knew, like they'd been expecting it. And maybe, I would later realize, they had been. 6 weeks passed before the second death. 6 weeks of jumping at shadows and lying awake at night, listening to sounds that shouldn't have been there. Creaking floorboards in the empty stockroom, whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls. A persistent feeling of being watched, even when I was completely alone. I told myself it was just grief. Owen's death had affected me more than I wanted to admit, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's what minds do when they're under stress. They find patterns in randomness. They see threats where none exist. I'd learned all about it during my time in AA, how the brain tries to protect itself by creating elaborate fictions that feel absolutely real. But some part of me knew that wasn't the whole truth. Some part of me knew that the things I was experiencing weren't just products of my imagination. They were too consistent, too specific, too real. Marcy Dillard was the only person I could talk to about it. She'd been working at the store for almost 8 years, ever since her husband died in a logging accident and left her to raise their son alone. She was a practical woman, not the type to believe in ghosts or curses or things that go bump in the night. But she'd seen enough in her time at Hale's general store to know that some things defied easy explanation. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked me one evening after we'd finished closing up. We were standing on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky behind the mountains. That feeling like something's watching, like something's waiting. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I felt it since my first week here," she continued. "Vernon calls it the presence, says it's been part of this place longer than the building itself, longer than the town even, something to do with the old mine, though he won't say exactly what." "The Blackwood mine?" She nodded. Owen used to talk about it sometimes when he'd had a few beers. Said there was something down in those tunnels that the miners disturbed back in the 80s. Something that should have stayed buried. She paused, her eyes distant. He said they tried to seal it in when they closed the mine, but it didn't work. Said it found another way out. Another way out where? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. We were both standing on it. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. Every day I went to work expecting something terrible to happen. And every day nothing did. The store hummed along like it always had, customers coming and going, the rhythms of small-town commerce playing out just like they had for decades. But underneath that normalcy, I could feel something building, a pressure, like the air before a thunderstorm, a sense of impending catastrophe that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Marcy felt it too. I could see it in the way she flinched at sudden sounds, in the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, in the way she'd sometimes stop mid-sentence and look around like she'd heard something the rest of us couldn't. The day she died started like any other. It was a Saturday morning in early December, one of our busiest times of the week. The store was packed with customers doing their weekend shopping, and I was working the floor helping people find what they needed while Marcy manned the register. Vernon was in his office doing paperwork, same as always. I was in the back corner of the store helping an elderly woman reach a box of oatmeal on a high shelf when I heard Marcy scream. It wasn't like Owen's scream, short and sharp and surprised. This was a sustained sound, a wail of pure terror that seemed to go on forever, drilling into my skull and freezing me in place. By the time I reached the front of the store, it was already over. Marcy was slumped against the register, her body rigid and her face twisted into an expression of absolute horror. Her eyes were wide open, staring at something that none of us could see. Her hands were raised in front of her, fingers curled like claws, as if she'd been trying to ward off an attack. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. The coroner said her heart had simply stopped, probably due to an undiagnosed condition that had been waiting years to manifest. "These things happen," he said. "People drop dead all the time with no warning. It's tragic but not uncommon. But I knew what I'd seen in the seconds before I reached her. Just a glimpse, a fraction of a moment, but enough. There had been something standing in front of the register, something that shouldn't have been there, a shape that was almost human but not quite, with proportions that were wrong in ways I couldn't fully articulate. It was there, and then it wasn't, vanishing the instant Marcy's scream cut off. And in the silence that followed, just before the chaos of people shouting and someone calling 911, I heard something else, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a sound like sighing, a sound like satisfaction, a sound like something feeding. After Marcy's death, I should have left. Any sane person would have. But I told myself that I owed it to her memory to stay, to help Vernon keep the store running, to not abandon the place just because I was scared. The truth was darker than that, though. The truth was that I didn't think I could leave even if I wanted to. The presence that Marcy had described, the one that Vernon called the old, hungry thing, I could feel it more strongly now than ever. It was like a weight pressing down on my chest every time I walked through the store's doors, like a whisper at the edge of my hearing that I could never quite make out, like eyes on the back of my neck that were always there, always watching, always waiting. Vernon changed after Marcy died. The quiet, dignified man I'd worked for had always carried himself with a certain stoic grace, but now he seemed diminished somehow, smaller. He spent more and more time in his office with the door closed, and when he did emerge, his eyes had a haunted quality that made me uncomfortable to look at. It was 3 days after Marcy's funeral when he finally told me the truth. We were alone in the store. It was well past closing time, and I'd stayed late to help with inventory. Vernon had been drinking, something I'd never seen him do before. He sat behind the counter with a bottle of bourbon in front of him and a look on his face like a man who'd finally run out of places to hide. "You've figured it out by now, haven't you?" he asked, his words slightly slurred. "You know there's something wrong with this place, something that's been wrong for a very long time." I nodded slowly. The presence, the thing Marcy told me about. Vernon laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's a presence. That's what I called it because I didn't have a better name. But it's more than just a presence, Caleb. It's something old, something hungry, something that's been feeding on this town for longer than anyone can remember." He took a long drink from the bottle and then continued. "My grandfather built this store in 1952. Did you know that? Built it right on top of the original settlement, the place where the first families put down roots back in the 1700s. He thought he was building something good, something that would serve the community for generations. But he didn't know what was underneath. None of us knew until it was too late. "What's underneath?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Vernon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's a cave system that runs under these mountains. Miles and miles of tunnels, some natural, some carved out by miners over the centuries. The Blackwood mine was just the latest operation to tap into it. But there are older tunnels too, much older, tunnels that were here before the Europeans came, before the Cherokee came, before anyone came." He paused, gathering himself. "The old stories say that something lives down there. The native peoples who passed through this area, they knew about it. They called it different names in different languages, but they all meant the same thing. The hungry one, the eater of years, the thing that waits in darkness." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the store. "That's what Owen said," I murmured. "Right before he died. He said something was awake, the old hungry thing." Vernon nodded slowly. "Owen knew more than most. He was there when they broke through into the old tunnels back in '86. He was there when they found the chamber." "What chamber?" "A cave," Vernon said. "Deep underground, at the end of a tunnel that shouldn't have existed. The walls were covered in symbols that no one could identify. Writings in a language that predated anything we have records of. And in the center of the cave, there was a pit, a hole that seemed to go down forever, so deep that when they dropped a flare into it, they never saw it hit bottom." He took another drink, his hands trembling. "Something came out of that pit. Owen never told me exactly what he saw, but whatever it was, it killed 3 of his crew before they could seal the tunnel. They tried to trap it down there, tried to brick up the entrance and pretend it never happened, but it didn't work. It found another way up." "The store," I said, understanding dawning. "The store," Vernon confirmed. "Built right on top of one of the old tunnel entrances. My grandfather didn't know. How could he? It had been sealed for centuries, covered over by the original settlers who built their church on this spot. They knew what was down there. They tried to contain it with their prayers and their rituals. But over time, people forgot. The church burned down, the old families died off, and eventually my grandfather came along and built his store without any idea what he was really building on top of." "So, what does it want?" I asked. "Why is it killing people?" Vernon looked at me with an expression that was equal parts pity and resignation. "It feeds on us, Caleb, on our fear, our pain, our life force. Every death that happens here, every moment of suffering, it all goes to sustaining that thing. That's why people don't live long in this town. That's why everyone seems so old before their time. That's why the store has had so many accidents over the years, so many unexplained deaths that everyone just accepts without question." He laughed again, that same humorless sound from before. "I've spent my whole life trying to keep it satisfied, trying to make sure it never gets so hungry that it starts taking people at random. The accidents, they're not accidents, they're sacrifices. Payment for being allowed to exist here. The families that founded this town, they made a deal with that thing generations ago. Their prosperity, their safety, in exchange for regular offerings." I felt sick. You knew Owen was going to die. You knew Marcy was going to die. And you just let it happen. "What choice did I have?" Vernon's voice cracked. "If I tried to stop it, it would take everyone. The whole town, every man, woman, and child. At least this way, it's only a few lives every few years. At least this way the rest of us get to keep living." I stood there in stunned silence, trying to process what he'd just told me. All those years, all those deaths, and it had all been part of some obscene bargain made before any of us were born. The store wasn't just a building. It was a feeding trough. "Why are you telling me this?" I finally asked. Vernon met my eyes, and in that moment, I saw the full weight of his exhaustion, his guilt, his despair. Because I'm old, Caleb. Too old to keep doing this. Too tired to keep making excuses and pretending everything is normal. And because it's hungry again. Hungrier than it's ever been. He paused. It wants another sacrifice. And I'm afraid this time, it wants me. Vernon died 3 days later. I found him in the stockroom, in almost exactly the same spot where Owen had died. But there were no collapsed shelves this time, no convenient accident to explain away what had happened. He was just lying there, his body perfectly intact, his face frozen in an expression of perfect peace. And written on the wall above him, in what I desperately hoped was red paint but knew wasn't, were words in a language I didn't recognize. The same symbols that Owen had seen in the cave. The same writing that the native peoples had left as warnings centuries ago. I didn't call the sheriff this time. I didn't call anyone. I just walked out of that store, got in my truck, and drove until I couldn't see Hollow Ridge in my rearview mirror anymore. That was 2 years ago. I've never been back, and I never will. I've tried to put it all behind me, to build a new life somewhere far from those cursed mountains. But some nights, when the darkness presses in and sleep won't come, I can still feel it watching me. Still feel that presence, that hunger, reaching out across the miles like a hand closing around my heart. The store is still there, or so I've heard. Someone bought it from Vernon's estate, some out-of-towner who probably thought they were getting a good deal on a piece of authentic Appalachian charm. I think about warning them sometimes, about driving back up into those mountains and telling them the truth about what they've really bought. But I never do, because I know it wouldn't make any difference. That thing under the store, the old hungry one, it's patient. It's been feeding on that valley for centuries, and it will keep feeding for centuries more. The faces change, the names change, but the arrangement stays the same. That's the deal the founders made, and there's no getting out of it. All you can do is hope that when the time comes for another sacrifice, it's not your name that gets called, and pray that it's satisfied with what it takes. The writing on the walls. I never planned to go back to Appalachia. After everything that happened at Hale's General Store, I'd sworn to myself that I'd never set foot in those mountains again. I'd moved to Charlotte, gotten a job at a warehouse, started going to meetings again. For almost 18 months, I'd managed to convince myself that what happened in Hollow Ridge was behind me, that I could move on with my life and pretend that none of it had ever happened. But the mountains have a way of calling you back. It started with the dreams, not nightmares exactly, more like memories that didn't belong to me, visions of tunnels stretching into darkness and walls covered in symbols that made my head hurt to look at. I'd wake up with the taste of copper on my tongue and the echo of whispers in my ears, words in a language I didn't understand, but somehow recognized. Then came the letters. The first one arrived in November, about 8 months after I'd fled Hollow Ridge. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my blood run cold. You were there. You know what we woke up. Help us before it takes everyone. It was signed with a name I'd never heard before. Thomas Dillard. I stared at that letter for a long time before it clicked. Dillard. Marcy's last name. She'd mentioned having a son, a boy who was away at college when she died. I'd never met him, never even seen a picture of him. But somehow, he'd found me. I threw the first letter away and tried to forget about it. But more came. Once a week, then twice a week, then every other day. Always the same message, always the same signature, always the same desperate tone. It's getting worse. People are disappearing. You're the only one who got out alive. Please. I should have kept ignoring them. I should have moved, changed my name, done whatever it took to put distance between myself and whatever was happening in those mountains. But there was something in those letters that wouldn't let me go. A quality of desperation that felt too real to dismiss. A sense that someone was in genuine trouble and I was the only one who could help. So in the end, against every instinct I had, I called the number Thomas had included in his last letter. I was starting to think you'd never call. His voice was young, early 20s maybe, but it carried the weight of someone much older. My mother told me about you before she died, said you were different from the others, said you actually cared about finding the truth. I'm sorry about your mother, I said, and meant it. She was a good woman. She was. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mr. Porter, I need to see you in person. I need to show you what I've found. There's a way to stop this thing, but I can't do it alone. Every cell in my body screamed at me to hang up, to throw my phone in the nearest river and never look back. But I thought about Marcy, about the terror on her face in those final moments. I thought about Owen and his whispered warning. I thought about Vernon and the guilt that had weighed on him like a physical burden. Where do I need to go? I asked. The place Thomas directed me to wasn't Hollow Ridge. It was another town about 20 miles northeast, a place called Shepherd's Gap that I'd passed through on my original drive into the mountains. It wasn't much bigger than Hollow Ridge, but it had a motel and a diner, which made it practically a metropolis by Appalachian standards. Thomas was waiting for me in the diner parking lot when I pulled in. He looked exactly like I'd expected, which is to say, he looked exactly like his mother. Same dark hair, same serious eyes, same set to his jaw that suggested a stubbornness that went bone deep. He was carrying a canvas messenger bag that bulged with papers and what looked like old books. "Thank you for coming," he said, shaking my hand. "I know this wasn't easy for you." "You said you found a way to stop it," I replied. "What did you mean by that?" Thomas led me into the diner and to a booth in the back corner, away from the handful of other customers. He ordered coffee for both of us and then spread his papers out on the table between us like a general laying out battle plans. "After my mother died, I started digging into the history of the area," he explained. "I mean, really digging. Town records, church archives, old family journals. I even spent a summer tracking down census records from before the Civil War." He tapped one of the papers, a photocopied map that looked incredibly old. "What I found goes back a lot further than Vernon Hale ever knew." Over the next 2 hours, Thomas laid out what he'd discovered. The presence under Hollow Ridge, the thing that had been feeding on the town for generations, wasn't unique to that one location. Similar entities, or maybe different manifestations of the same entity, existed throughout the Appalachian Mountain range. The native peoples who had lived here before European contact had known about them and had developed rituals to keep them contained. But when the settlers came, those rituals were lost, and the things that had been sleeping underground began to wake up. "The symbols," Thomas said, showing me a page covered in drawings that made my stomach turn. "They're wards, containment seals. The old peoples carved them into cave walls and the foundations of sacred structures to keep these things bound. When the symbols are maintained, the entities stay dormant. But when they're forgotten or destroyed, they start feeding," I finished. Thomas nodded grimly. "Vernon's grandfather built his store right on top of one of the old ward sites. The original church that stood there, it was built by settlers who understood what they were dealing with. They maintained the symbols, kept up the rituals. But when the church burned down and Vernon's family took over the land, they had no idea what they were erasing." "So what do we do?" I asked. "How do we fix it?" Thomas reached into his bag and pulled out a leather-bound journal that looked like it might crumble to dust if you handled it too roughly. This belonged to a man named Ezekiel Hatch. He was a minister in Hollow Ridge back in the 1840s. He's the one who built the original church, and he's the one who carved the first wards into its foundation. He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon. He also wrote down exactly how to restore them. I looked at the cramped, old-fashioned handwriting and the diagrams that accompanied it. Even without understanding the symbols, I could feel the power in them. A heaviness, like gravity pulling at something inside me. The catch is that the wards have to be placed in the exact location where the original ones stood, Thomas continued. Which means going back to Hollow Ridge, going back to the store, going down to where this thing actually lives. I stared at him. You want me to go back into those tunnels? After everything that happened? I want us to go, Thomas corrected. I can't do this alone. The ritual requires 2 people. Someone to draw the wards and someone to speak the words. And it has to be done during the winter solstice, when the barrier between our world and wherever these things come from is at its thinnest. That's in 3 weeks. I know. I sat back in the booth, my mind racing. Everything I'd spent the last 2 years trying to forget was rushing back with brutal clarity. The screams, the deaths, the feeling of something ancient and malevolent watching from the darkness. The idea of voluntarily walking back into that nightmare seemed like the height of insanity. But then I thought about what Vernon had told me, about the bargain that had been made, the sacrifices that had been offered, the lives that had been traded for an illusion of safety. I thought about Marcy and Owen and all the others whose names I'd never know, people who had died to keep that thing satisfied. And I thought about all the people who would continue to die as long as it remained awake and hungry. What do we need to do? I asked. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas had spent years researching the ritual, but actually performing it required materials and knowledge that weren't easy to come by. We needed specific herbs that only grew in certain elevations. We needed chalk made from limestone, quarried from the original ward sites. We needed a copy of Ezekiel Hatch's prayer book, the actual one he'd used to consecrate the original church, which had ended up in a private collection in Knoxville and required a combination of persuasion and outright bribery to borrow. By the time the solstice arrived, I felt like I'd completed an advanced degree in Appalachian folklore. Thomas had drilled me on every aspect of the ritual, making me practice the words and gestures until I could do them in my sleep. He'd explained the theory behind the wards, the way they worked to channel the energy of the earth itself into barriers that these entities couldn't cross. He'd shown me the mistakes that had been made in the past, the rituals that had gone wrong, and the terrible consequences that had followed. And through it all, the dreams kept coming. But they were different now. Instead of visions of darkness and symbols, I dreamed of light, of standing in a tunnel filled with a warm, golden glow, holding something back through sheer force of will. I didn't know if the dreams were prophecy or wishful thinking, but I held on to them all the same. We drove to Hollow Ridge on the morning of December 21st. The town looked the same as I remembered, maybe a little more run down, maybe a little emptier. The store was still there, still open, now operated by a young couple who had no idea what they'd gotten themselves into. Thomas had considered warning them, but decided against it. If our ritual worked, they'd never need to know. And if it didn't, well, nothing would matter much after that anyway. We parked outside of town and hiked in through the woods, following a path that Thomas had mapped out based on old survey records. It led to a cave entrance about half a mile from the store, an opening in the rock that had been concealed by a century of vegetation but was still marked on maps from the 18th century. According to Thomas's research, this was how Ezekiel Hatch had originally accessed the tunnels. It was the back door, so to speak, the one that led directly to the chamber where the entity dwelt. The entrance was smaller than I'd expected, just a crack in a limestone outcropping that we had to squeeze through sideways. Roots from the trees above dangled through gaps in the rock like grasping fingers. And the stone itself was cold and damp beneath my hands as I pushed through. For a terrible moment, I felt stuck, trapped between walls of ancient rock with the weight of the mountain pressing down above me. Then I was through, stumbling into darkness that seemed to swallow my headlamp's beam after just a few feet. But once we were inside, the passage opened up into a tunnel tall enough to stand in. The walls were rough-hewn, clearly carved by human hands at some point in the distant past, though the tool marks had been softened by centuries of mineral deposits and water seepage. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth in a giant's mouth, and somewhere in the distance I could hear the steady drip of water echoing through chambers I couldn't see. Thomas switched on his headlamp, and I did the same, and we started walking into the darkness. I'd like to say that I felt brave, that all my preparations had steeled me for what was to come, and I descended into those tunnels with confidence and purpose. But the truth is that I was terrified. Every step took me further from safety and closer to something that I knew, with absolute certainty, wanted me dead. The tunnel sloped steadily downward, sometimes leveling out for stretches before plunging again. We passed side passages that branched off into darkness, openings that seemed to exhale cold, stale air as we went by. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of the symbols Thomas had shown me, carved into the stone walls at irregular intervals. Some were intact, still carrying that strange weight I'd felt when I first saw them in the journal, but others had been scratched out or worn away, their power broken. "This is why it woke up," Thomas murmured, running his fingers over a defaced ward. Decades of mining, of excavation, of people not knowing what they were destroying. Every broken symbol weakened the barrier a little more, until finally there wasn't enough left to hold it. We walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to 40 minutes. The air grew colder and heavier with each passing minute, until it felt like trying to breathe through a wet blanket. And there was something else too, a presence at the edge of my perception that I recognized all too well. It knew we were here. It was waiting. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a chamber. I'd expected it to be large based on Vernon's description, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer scale of what we found. The cave stretched out before us like an underground cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows far above our headlamp's reach. The walls were covered in symbols, thousands of them, carved into every available surface in patterns that made my eyes water to look at. And in the center of the chamber, just as Vernon had described, was the pit. It was maybe 30 feet across, perfectly circular, with edges that looked almost too smooth to be natural. No light penetrated its depths. Even our headlamps seemed to be swallowed up the moment their beams crossed its threshold. It was like looking into the absence of everything, a void where reality simply stopped. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where we do it." We moved quickly, setting up for the ritual at 4 points around the pit's circumference. Thomas had marked the locations based on Ezekiel Hatch's journal, spots where the original wards had been placed before they were destroyed by miners who had no idea what they were disturbing. At each point, we drew new symbols on the cave floor using the limestone chalk, careful to match every line and curve exactly as they appeared in the journal. As we worked, I became aware of something changing in the chamber. The cold was intensifying, dropping from uncomfortable to painful, to something that felt like it was trying to freeze me from the inside out. And there was a sound now, a low vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like the whole mountain was humming, like something vast and ancient was stirring in its sleep. "It knows what we're doing," Thomas said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "We need to hurry." We completed the wards just as the humming reached a crescendo. Thomas took his position at the northern point of the circle while I moved to the south. He opened Ezekiel Hatch's prayer book and began to read, his voice steady despite everything. The words were in a language I didn't recognize. Not English, not Latin, not anything I'd ever heard before. But as Thomas spoke them, I felt their power resonating through the chamber, through the stone, through me. The symbols on the floor began to glow with a faint golden light, the same light I'd seen in my dreams. Then something rose from the pit. I can't describe what I saw. My mind refuses to hold the memory in any coherent form. It was darkness given shape, hunger given form. Everything that humanity has ever feared about the dark made manifest. It towered over us, filling the chamber with a presence that felt like it was crushing my very soul. The temperature plummeted further, so cold that frost began forming on my eyelashes, and every breath felt like inhaling razor blades. The glow from our wards flickered and dimmed, as if the thing's mere presence was enough to snuff out any light that dared oppose it. I saw shapes within the darkness. Not faces exactly, but suggestions of faces. Thousands of them, maybe millions. All the souls that had been consumed over countless centuries, now absorbed into something vast and terrible and eternally hungry. I thought I recognized some of them. Owen's weathered features, Marcy's kind eyes, Vernon's tired smile. They swirled within the darkness like leaves caught in a whirlpool, their mouths open in silent screams that would never be heard. And it spoke. Not in words exactly, more like thoughts forced directly into my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. It said that we were fools, that we didn't understand what we were dealing with, that the bargain had been made centuries ago and could not be broken, that we belonged to it now, just like everyone else who had ever walked these mountains. Thomas kept reading. His voice was shaking now, but he didn't stop. The symbols glowed brighter, and I could see the thing recoiling from them, its form flickering and distorting where the light touched it. I knew what I had to do. Thomas had prepared me for this moment, drilled into me the words I needed to speak when the time came. I opened my mouth and began to recite them, joining my voice to his in a chant that echoed off the chamber walls and seemed to grow in power with every syllable. The thing screamed. Not a sound, but a sensation, a wave of pure hatred and rage that hit me like a physical force. I staggered, but kept speaking. Blood was running from my nose, and my ears were ringing, but I kept speaking. And then, impossibly, it began to retreat. The darkness collapsed in on itself, pulling back toward the pit like water spiraling down a drain. The symbols flared with blinding intensity, and I had to close my eyes against the brilliance. But even through my eyelids, I could see the light growing brighter and brighter, until it seemed like the whole world was made of nothing but pure golden radiance. When I opened my eyes again, the thing was gone. The chamber was silent except for our ragged breathing. The symbols on the floor still glowed faintly, but the terrible cold had lifted, and the oppressive presence had vanished. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I could actually breathe. "Did it work?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. Thomas was staring at the pit, his face pale but his eyes bright with something that might have been triumph. "I think so," he said. "The wards are in place. The barrier is restored. It won't be able to reach the surface anymore." "Is it dead?" He shook his head slowly. "Something like that can't die. Not really. But it's contained now, bound. As long as the wards remain intact, it won't be able to hurt anyone ever again." We made our way out of the tunnels in a daze, too exhausted to talk. By the time we emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, I felt like I'd aged a decade. But it was worth it. Whatever price I'd paid, it was worth it. Thomas and I stayed in Shepherd's Gap that night, getting blind drunk at the motel bar and talking about everything except what we'd just done. In the morning, we said our goodbyes and went our separate ways. He was going back to finish his degree. I was going back to Charlotte, to my warehouse job and my meetings and my quiet little life. But I knew, as I drove away from those mountains for what I hoped was the last time, that something had changed in me. I'd faced the thing that had taken so much from so many people, and I'd helped put it back in its cage. It didn't undo the deaths. It didn't erase the suffering, but it meant that maybe, just maybe, the future would be different. The mountains are still there, of course. They'll always be there, ancient and inscrutable, keeping their secrets buried deep. But somewhere under Hollow Ridge, in a chamber that most people will never know exists, there are symbols carved into stone that weren't there before. Wards against the darkness. Proof that even the oldest evils can be bound. And that, I think, is enough. I keep in touch with Thomas. We talk on the phone every few weeks, comparing notes on our research, sharing stories from our separate journeys through the aftermath of what we experienced. He finished his degree and is now working toward a doctorate in folklore studies, focusing on the intersection of indigenous American mythology and early European settlement patterns. Fancy academic language for what really amounts to mapping where the monsters live. Last month, he told me something that's been weighing on my mind ever since. He'd been going through some old documents at the university library, records from the colonial period that had been donated by a family in Virginia. Among them was a letter from a minister who had traveled through what is now West Virginia in the 1750s, decades before the area was formally settled. The minister described encountering a native guide who warned him away from a particular valley, a place where three ridges met and where, according to the guide, the earth itself was hungry. The guide told the minister that his people had known about the valley for generations. They had names for the thing that lived beneath it, names in languages that have since been lost to time. But the meaning was always the same. The eater, the hungry one, the thing that waits. The guide also told the minister something else. He said that his people had learned over centuries of living alongside these entities that they could be contained, but never destroyed. That they were part of the land itself, woven into the bedrock and the water and the air. To destroy them would be to destroy the mountains themselves. But containment, the guide insisted, was possible. It required vigilance and sacrifice, ritual and faith. It required people who understood what they were dealing with and were willing to dedicate their lives to keeping the barriers strong. I think about that guide sometimes. I wonder what his name was, what became of his people, whether any of his descendants are still out there keeping the old knowledge alive. I wonder if he would be proud of what Thomas and I did, or if he would be horrified that we came so close to failing. Mostly, though, I wonder how many other places like Hollow Ridge are out there. How many valleys and hollows and forgotten corners of these ancient mountains are home to things that should never have been awakened? How many towns are living under bargains they don't even know about, feeding something in the dark without ever understanding what they're truly giving? The answer, I suspect, is more than anyone wants to know. What lives in the old places. There's a postscript to this story, something I've never told anyone until now. 3 months after Thomas and I performed the ritual, I got a letter. Not from Thomas this time, but from an organization I'd never heard of. They called themselves the Keepers of the Old Ways, and their letter was an invitation. They'd heard about what we'd done in Hollow Ridge, they said. They were impressed, and they wanted to offer me a job. It turned out that we weren't the first people to successfully bind one of these entities, not by a long shot. The keepers had been doing it for centuries, working in secret to maintain the wards that kept ancient evils contained all across the Appalachians and beyond. They were historians and ritualists, scholars and practitioners, ordinary people who had stumbled onto the truth and chosen to do something about it. I met with their representative in a coffee shop in Asheville. She was an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes, and she told me things about the mountains that made everything I'd experienced seem almost tame by comparison. There were dozens of entities like the one under Hollow Ridge, she said. Maybe hundreds. Most were contained, their wards maintained by keepers who dedicated their lives to the work. But some had slipped their bonds over the years, and others were straining against barriers that had weakened with time. We need people like you, she told me. People who've seen what's out there and survived. People who understand what's at stake. I told her I'd think about it, and I did. For months, I turned the offer over in my mind, weighing the safety of my quiet life against the knowledge that there were things out there that most people couldn't even imagine, things that would keep feeding, keep killing, keep destroying unless someone stood against them. In the end, there was really only one choice. I joined the Keepers 3 years ago. Since then, I've helped maintain wards in 6 different states. I've faced things that make the entity under Hollow Ridge look almost friendly by comparison. I've lost colleagues and friends to the darkness, and I've saved lives that would have been lost without our intervention. It's not easy work. It's not safe work. Every time I descend into another tunnel or step into another abandoned church or walk into another place where the veil between worlds has grown thin, there's a chance I won't walk out again. But I keep doing it, because I've seen what happens when no one does, because I've felt the weight of ancient evil pressing against the barriers that protect us, and I know how fragile those barriers really are. Because somewhere out there, in some town that's not on any map, there's another Owen, another Marcy, another Vernon, who's made peace with feeding his neighbors to something that should have stayed buried forever. And because every now and then, against all odds, we win. That's the real story of what happened in Hollow Ridge. Not just a tale of horror and death, but a story about ordinary people standing up against extraordinary evil. About sacrifice and courage and the stubborn human refusal to accept that some things can't be fought. The mountains keep their secrets. They always have, and they always will. But now I keep secrets too. And some of them, the ones that really matter, I'm keeping safe. If you're reading this, and something about it resonates with you, if you've seen things in the mountains that you can't explain, if you've felt that presence watching from the darkness, know that you're not alone. There are others out there who understand, others who have faced what you've faced and survived. The Appalachians are the oldest mountains in the world. They were ancient before the dinosaurs walked the earth, before life crawled out of the oceans, before anything we would recognize as living existed at all. And in all that time, things have accumulated in their depths, things that were here when the world was young and formless, things that have been waiting, patient and hungry, for opportunities that sometimes come. But for every ancient evil, there are people standing against it. For every hungry darkness, there are lights that refuse to go out. That's what I've learned in my time with the Keepers. Not that the monsters can be destroyed, but that they don't have to win. That courage and knowledge and the simple, stubborn refusal to give up can make a difference, even against forces that have existed since before time had meaning. Hollow Ridge is quiet now. The new owners of the store report no strange occurrences, no unexplained deaths, no presence watching from the shadows. The wards we placed in that chamber are holding, and if they're maintained properly, they'll keep holding for centuries to come. But somewhere out there, in some other valley, some other town, some other forgotten corner of these ancient mountains, something else is stirring. Something else is waking up. And when it does, someone will have to stand against it. That's the real lesson of what happened in Hollow Ridge. Not that evil exists, though it certainly does. Not that the darkness is hungry, though it always has been. But that ordinary people, armed with knowledge and courage and each other, can push back the night. And sometimes, against all odds, we win.